it by critical function. Hospitals are going to modify it. The bolded ones that don't show up well here though, but what's bolded is from the chart or in the tool. And we're going to use the bulk oxygen example. We're going to, now we can go to the next one. We're going to take the inventory sustainability period in hours, column F in the tool. And we're going to carry it over here, and why don't you go to your severe weather tab. Shannon's populated this chart based on their top HVA, severe weather?
Yeah, it's in our top.
What, okay. So the HVA is severe weather, and we know that the bulk oxygen will last for 51 hours. And we're going to code, Chris, maybe you can go to the next one. We're going to use a color coding system to define some periods. Green means that our resources are known, or we've calculated them to be available, or we've estimated through our reasonable assumption process them to be available. And there's no impact on normal operations. Yellow, we're going to code that in a period of hours for where our resources are no longer known, and or we're either out of them or we don't know, and the potential exists for an impact on normal operations. We're going to implement appropriate emergency operation plans to mitigate the impact of the event. For planning purposes, that's kind of worded like we're in a response, but for planning purposes, we're going to look after the green period. We know we last 51 hours. After that, we're going to look to our plans and our mitigation strategies, and we're going to make an estimate of how long we can continue with emergency operations, with our mitigation strategies, and we're going to code that period of time yellow. I don't know what that number of hours is, but Shannon's told us that given their mitigation strategies, consumption adjustments, they can continue to operate with bulk oxygen up to 84 hours. At 84 hours, normal and emergency operations are significantly impacted. All internal resources and strategies to mitigate the impact have been depleted. We're basing this on the 96 or the Joint Commission standard of standing alone. If a hospital, but a hospital's not tied to that for use of this, if you want to make an assumption that your bulk oxygen supplier is across the street, just happens to be there, and you know that regardless of the event or regardless of the situation, even though it's snowing heavily, you can still get the bulk oxygen. So you're going to make a different determination here, that's fine. So what we're going to end up with here is a chart that's color-coded and that will identify what items are going to be depleted the quickest, what items you have planning that needs to be conducted for, and time periods where in an event your incident command is going to need to give their first attention or priority attention. You can type in any notations that you want into the color coding, maybe referencing the plan that addresses the mitigation, or any other notations that might help you with the planning. So, what do you get here at the end of this with the color coded? You know, really what you get is a visual representation to help guide you on the decisions that you need to make for planning purposes, and then decisions that are probably going to come up first during the response. Let me stop there with regard to the chart. Discussion, questions?
I just wanted to let everybody know that Keller Army Community Hospital uses a model very similar to this. And I was fortunate enough to be able to sit in on the emergency management review of their Joint Commission survey last week. And they loved this. They thought this was really, really great. And they said, you know, and we just want you to know that we don't expect you to be able to maintain everything 96 hours as long as you have a plan on how you'll address those issues that fall into the yellow and the red. But they really, really like this color-coded chart.
Thank you, because I had really forgot to mention that fact, that, for instance, as we were going through this, developing all of this, I was at Carthage Hospital, and it's a small facility. And I'm sitting in the emergency preparedness coordinator's office, and I see this big rolled up paper, you know, the size of that screen with a bunch of colors that kind of look like this. And I said, Dale, what is that? And he pulled it out, he said, oh, this is awesome. He says, Joint Commission loved this. They came in and they took one look at this chart, and they just, you know, that was it. I said, where'd you get it? And they paid a consultant for it, apparently. It wasn't exactly, the concept was the same concept. So I do know of other hospitals that have used this type of thing with Joint Commission. So, you know, there is a value to it. For the deliverable, you know, what do you need to do? Some things are going to be very simple, like elevator. You know, you're going to decide the elevator either works or doesn't. So at hour 0, it's out. And if you say we're really screwed, you can color that whole 96 hours red, or you can decide. You know, you might view it differently. You might say the elevator's out, but it doesn't impact our normal operations. We can carry on for the full 96 hours and code it all green. Little work, little time, little effort involved in that decision making. Other items, as you can see, with gathering the inventory data, going to be much more time consuming. And the discussion and the decision making about how long, all right, we know it goes out at 51 hours, the bulk oxygen is depleted. But how long can we continue through consumption adjustments? How long can we continue? You know, those discussions may be more complex and time consuming.
Then they want to increase their inventory, you know, after going through this planning and have more bulk oxygen available. That would be one strategy.
So, you know, I guess the point of the chart is simply to, you know, help the hospitals go through the process, go through the discussion, and be able to visualize what their resource sustainability looks like, and help identify their priorities for planning and during an incident. Anything else on the chart?
When you go from the tool to the chart, and this is just an Excel question, it doesn't self-populate those.
No, and,
Not that fancy.
you know, I don't know if it was you, Mike, or somebody else, you know, brought that up. Could we do that? That'd be great. If somebody can figure that out, you know, that'd
Well, I
be
know
nice.
you can go from one page to another to populate, but to color code, I don't know
Well,
if you can do.
the thing about, and we talked about this in a lot of our conversations, is the green is the part that, if that was
Right.
possible, would be copied over. I mean, the yellow mitigation strategies are really facility specific about what you have in place already as a mitigation plan and in the planning process, and how you think that would extend you out through that yellow period of time. And that's kind of why we like the idea of using your HVA specific scenarios to kind of think through those mitigation strategies, because, you know, it'd be very different, from one hazard to another,
Well,
what strategies we use. So I don't know how we did, maybe it could populate the green for you, but then everybody'd still be going into to do the yellow.
You know, in terms of the tabs down here, we've got instructions. This one, chart planning, it's blank. And then what Shannon's done here at Albany Med is she's created a tab for your HVA specific, severe weather. You can copy the chart over to create different HVA specific charts. Or if you should choose, no, I don't know if a hospital would do this or not, but you could take during an event, during a severe weather event, your planning chart, put it up there, and visualize that, and track in real time. Where are you really?
Yeah, our incident command team at Albany Med likes the idea of this visual, in particular for the incident commander and other sections to use, but for the planning section to be using the tool to extend out for our future operational periods, to really think through what resources we need in those periods as we go forward. So the visual, though, I think for most folks on our incident command team is really helpful to see really crystal clear for this event. These are what we think are our critical resources, and we're green to here, and that's when we're gonna hit a big problem.
Andrew, I have a more practical question. So this is a train of trainers for the RRC, RTC. I was wondering if you are offering some sort of reach back option in case they would need some more support during, the development of their program while they're, training hospitals. If there are questions or they would need some clarifications during the course of the year, if they can reach you back and you can, get back to them as a resource.
Yeah, when we leave here today, we will finalize these documents, with any feedback, and we'll send them out to you. As you're working through it, you have questions, we are available. As you're thinking through how you want to present this, we can talk about that a little bit. We will make ourselves available, to every extent possible. I don't know if I'm gonna make it down to Long Island to run the PowerPoint for you, not Linda, Connie, but, we'll do anything we can to make this easy for you. We've talked about recommendations for how you might present this. I guess we don't offer any formal recommendations, and, respect your expertise in presenting this.
I do think you can take the materials, the PowerPoint, the tool, the chart, and present it in a very similar fashion to what we just did here.
Yeah, I think you could do it just like this. If you can edit that PowerPoint any way you want. If you want more information about some aspect of this, we got 45 slides here. We started with like 120. So we've got a lot more material.
You can thank Shannon for that.
Crossing them out.
Yeah.
Not the 100.
No.
So we have more material if you think there's an important aspect that you want to focus on. If you think that the progression of how we present it could be done differently or better, feel free. But, we tried to kind of outline that pre-planning, what do you need to get in order to use the tool, and then going to the chart. But you could certainly present the chart up front. Anybody have thoughts about how you might present this?
I just wanted to touch on what the element of completion is for the hospitals. for the tool, you know, how many, what are they being asked to do if it's one HVA specific scenario with a minimum of 20 critical assets, or, you know, what did they have to do?
Well, we've had some discussion, Mike, I'll let him speak specifically to that, but, you know, one of those top concepts is that this is fully scalable. So the hospital, you know, it's up to the hospital to decide what are the critical resources and assets and how you break those down. So, a hospital's list might be 20 because they've done it in broad categories. Their list might be 100 because they've detailed it. So, you know, our suggestion has been that this be done with your top HVA and, you know, with the concept that it's fully scalable and modifiable. You know, and that there's no right or wrong answers.
Andrew, when you say your top HVA, is the recommendation you're making to the instructors to say to the hospitals, take the highest ranking hazard on your hazard vulnerability analysis and use this only for that? Or are you, is the recommendation in the way you want this instructed, or suggested instructed, that you use the top 5, or you use some element of your facility's history, like we've experienced X, Y, and Z, whatever.
Our recommendation for
What do you-
completing the deliverable, let's start there, I think is that you use, maybe it'd be better to say a top HVA rather than the top HVA. But an HVA specific, and I'll walk you through the difference between an HVA specific and all hazard claim. I've gone through this with a few hospitals, you know, one-on-one with emergency preparedness coordinators. And I've asked them, is the value to you more in doing this from an all hazards perspective or an HVA specific? I got some different answers, but I was beginning on the presumption that, based on discussions with them, that start with start with all hazards planning, because a lot of the determinations would be the same through different HVAs. And then you can go and decide, make those calculations and those assumptions that are different under different HVAs. And that's what 2 of the emergency preparedness coordinators said. That's the way we would do it. We'd start from all hazards, and then we'd go and address those ones that would be different under different HVAs, and we'd address them specifically. However, for the purpose of the deliverable, I don't.
The deliverable only requests that, or requires that you complete and submit the tool. The deliverable does not differentiate between the chart, which is what we're looking at now, and the calculator tool. What Andrew and I spoke about, his question to me was, do you want both the calculator tool and the chart? And my response was, my first blush of it was, if you're gonna use the results of the calculator tool to populate the chart, then we really need the chart. I shouldn't say need, but we would require the chart, because that's the end product of the work. We didn't get into any discussion of, you know, whether this was all hazards or not. I think that from the perspective of the program, it's, you know, I think from the perspective of our profession of emergency management and the management of the facilities, that we should be recommending to them, the way you should use the tool is, and this is my opinion at this point, this is not a statement, is from a more or less an all hazards perspective, and use it so that you really are preparing your facility for the kinds of challenges it is likely to see, not things that are you know, wildly out of you know, not plausible. They're possible in the grand scheme of things, but they're not plausible for you. So if you are if your HVA has X number of items on it, at the very least, you'd wanna be looking at those items. And I guess my question is in reference to, you mentioned Carthage Hospital, and I'm not singling that one out, but the gentleman who had the big rollout of paper, did that facility approach it from an all hazards perspective? Or did they approach it only from one or two of these items? And what does Joint Commission expect the facility to be able to show
I
for
think
96 hours?
from my perspective, when we were talking through this, I think the intention was to use the tool to list as many critical assets as you can, thinking through all hazards, what your hospital considers critical. So for planning purposes, you could use your average daily census and come up with those calculations. But when you transfer it into this chart, it would be very difficult on a chart that listed everything to figure out this yellow piece of my mitigation strategy unless I'm talking about a specific scenario. So I think what we had talked about was, yes, you want to start with the tool and calculate as many critical assets as you can come up with for your facility. But in terms of moving to the chart and for the purposes of your deliverable, at a minimum, you want to start with this, a high ranked item on your HBA and work through that, because and recommend that you want to move forward in all the scenarios your facility deems most appropriate or that rank highly on your HBA, because it's time consuming to talk, not only to quantify all those different pieces, but to get to that mitigation planning portion with your emergency management committee and to really talk through those pieces. So to get to the yellow piece here, our feeling was that you had to focus on a scenario specific.
So,
You're confusing me now.
let me ask you then, because I may have to go back on what I just said. I have to change hats here from an emergency manager to grant manager to project manager and all of that stuff. If a facility, what you're saying is the appropriate use of this tool for the facility is to determine all of its critical resources and assets. All relative term, but more than one or two. In other words, look at pretty much everything we have and take the majority of them, whatever that might be. And again, we're not, there's no predetermined number on that list. It could be 22, it could be 46, it could be 10. I can't say. We know that facilities have all of these various different resources. There's gonna be a lot of items on that list, clearly, some more important than others, but there's gonna be a lot of items. I don't think you expect them necessarily to go down to the level of tongue depressor, but key items that you need to have to accomplish your clinical mission. And that's all gonna be on the calculator. But on the chart, you're saying that they could have only one or two green to yellow to red. Am I correct on that?
Well, this is just me,
Well, no,
speaking
no.
for Andrew and Chris, but one of the conflicts that I kept struggling with was when you take all of those assets from the tool that you've calculated and you transfer them into this chart. So you're looking at this blank chart, and everything that you've calculated is listed in that column B. What you really have is green and red. You've got, your calculation took you out to this point in green, and right now everything else is red. We struggled, Scott and I talking through some of these pieces, to in an all hazard chart that's listing everything for anything we came up with, to plug in a mitigation strategy, because it would be very different to us how we would mitigate use of that resource, or how we would adjust the consumption rate if we're talking about severe weather, if we're talking about a pandemic. So you may have this overall chart, green and red, just showing how far out in green you were, but to really talk about your mitigation strategies and how far out that could extend you'd be looking at your specific scenarios.
So for the program, go ahead.
There's no mitigation strategy in the chart itself. The tool is not, the tool may help you identify where you need a mitigation strategy.
Well, that's what, yes.
But as far as elements of completion and deliverable, you complete the chart.
Well, right, so this chart right here.
You do not have to identify mitigation
That's
strategies,
right.
consumption adjustments.
Right.
That's what I'm saying.
So this should come back with green stripes or lack thereof, green or red, but not necessarily yellow. because that's gonna require something else,
Right.
those mitigation strategies, which are not,
I think that's even easier as an element of
Well, that's the
completion for
conclusion,
folks,
that's the
so
same conclusion
that's
we came
kind of
to.
what I had come
Yeah.
to, thinking that folks wanted to
What time is the
see,
chart useless? Because
you know, the next
Well,
step would be
what
for
if a
a
hospital's
hospital
just gonna go for, let's say, for some reason the funding, we hope they don't, they have their own chart,
well,
we use for the funding, it's a useless exercise if they don't go through the mitigation.
but
Well-
we wouldn't know what the mitigation strategies are
I don't know that I
anyway.
think it's useless, I mean, I think when you see this chart overall, green and red, and you know what your highest ranked HVA items are, it's useful for your facility to still see that in green and red and say, we're in the red the most on these things, and we know that that would be a high priority item in our top 3 HVA events, so let's talk about mitigation
Well, what are
strategies
the
for
top
that.
3 HVAs, and we've had a few where they're internal flooding, internal spill, and elevator malfunction. This would not apply, because you're not looking at 96-hour sustainability for any of those 3 things.
Is our goal kind of
Say-
to
I'm
get
sorry,
them
Drew.
started on
Oh,
the
there
tool
is
though?
elevator.
You know, like make sure they
Yeah, but it's not
understand how
96-hour
to use it
sustainability
and then
piece,
Yeah.
so-
show them the possibilities of it, make
Yeah.
sure that they've used it enough and then allow them
But
in the
this isn't,
future
it's a
to.
tool, it's an option for people to use,
Right.
they're not
I
required
think that
to
what you
use
just
this
said is,
tool.
is key, you wanna get hospital familiar with the tool, using the tool, understanding, you know, how it works. And they can, you know, they gotta walk before you run, and I
Well,
think that once they learn the process, they'll say, well, we can do this for this, and when they're looking at the chart and they're seeing a whole bunch of red, they may say, well, what can we do to get a little yellow here?
From
Yeah, but you
our
can't determine the
perspective
yellow
on a contract,
at that point.
You could train them to the yellow, the use of the yellow. You'd want to emphasize that, you know, like they did in this training, that it should be, their mitigation strategies ultimately should be included, but
I know, but if say
Do we
say you
need
have
it?
the green, you have the
Right.
green and the red, you have that line. The yellow has to be within the green. I mean, you're moving, aren't you? Like moving from the green period a couple hours before, making that yellow and seeing that you can stretch it into the red. I don't know, using your mitigation. So I mean, it gives you a good point of where you're.
By using a mitigation strategy, right?
Is the charter confident though, or are you trying?
So it
the
does
yellow
not-
is
Yellow
arbitrary. That's your own
Yellow is
decision of when you
subjective
would
based
go.
on your
I mean, you
facility's
can't
decision
go
about
to
how
the
you
end of the
do it.
green and then have yellow.
You're
extending
You have to move that yellow
to where it would have been red by
we reach a
mitigating.
conclusion on this, we're gonna have to regroup
Right?
to make sure that the statements that are made in the course of the class are appropriate. And my sense is that the program receiving the chart, I'm sorry, that the program receiving the Excel calculator is information we're not gonna do anything with, frankly. If you say that your green, I'm making this up, patient care staff from hour 0 to hour 42, I'm not, you know, from the programmatic perspective, I don't think we're looking to say, prove that, or show that. I really don't think that's not a piece of information for us to use. But I am a little concerned, not concerned, about, I don't want them to be overstressed and have to say, well, there's 43 items there and I've got to give you all of this stuff for each of these items. But I do think that, and this is just off the top of my head, that maybe they should identify, and I throw this out as a thought to you guys, they should identify the top 5 hazard items, again, I'm making that up. And at least for those items, they should be able to show that there's a mitigation, plan, it extends for X amount of time, and here's where we run out of red. Because I mean, I'm sensitive to what Drew was saying, we don't wanna just receive a whole bunch of colors, but the deliverable from a contractual perspective doesn't get into any of that specific. So I also don't want them to get into the position where we're over-interpreting the element of completion.
I don't
there's
think
kind
we
of a
want to
gray
be
there.
too prescriptive
No.
in that, you know, we want them to use this in a manner that will suit their planning and incident response.
Maximally.
Yes. And one thing to keep in mind, I think, is that, you know, this process it's time consuming.
Oh, yeah.
And, you know, as I sat with hospitals on this, I have gotten different views on whether the maximum value is starting from all hazards and then going into HVA specific or HVA specific, but what everybody stresses is that, but I am not going to get there you know, starting from all hazards planning and working through HVA specific, I am not gonna get there with my emergency management committee in time for this deliverable. That stretched out, all-inclusive process. I think we need to keep in mind, the people hours involved here at the facility. 5,000's a nice chunk of money, but, this is gonna be time intensive. And so, I think HR as, you know, as they wanna,
I guess the question is like, what would be
I mean,
the minimum?
Yeah,
We came up with some sort of arbitrary ones, I mean.
yeah, one suggestion from one of the hospitals was, you know, what if, you've got 46 or something, things here, what if, you told, because I asked, I said, if we set some minimum, what would you think would be reasonable? So, well, you know, what if we did one out of each critical function, for a minimum of 15?
that's a lot.
That's a lot.
You know, so, you know, have to complete at least 15 resource and asset calculations and all that. That was his.
I mean, I think introducing select the top 5 hazards, that's confusing in process. The
Oh, I'm
spreadsheet
sorry,
has
I don't
nothing
mean
to-
15 hazard vulnerability,
Oh, you mean
I
15.
mean 15, yeah.
No, but I'm saying select your top hazards as a starting point. It's confusing because it has nothing to do with what's in here. This is
Well, that's not the
infrastructure
starting
items and equipment that are always at the facility. It's just a
You
choice
threw
of
that out
which
as
ones
a
you think are
number.
most
So you need
relevant.
to
give them an
across the 6.
And have them some justification.
And go through the responsibility.
Propane, natural gas, water boiler, those are always there. It doesn't matter whether it's a tornado, a hurricane, a fire.
Correct, that's where you start, is with those basic elements.
Figure out which equipment and
So the idea of having one for each of the
Perhaps we should have this discussion offline and we
Yeah,
can
yeah,
get
I
back to
think we
the,
should.
to the larger group on this.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think this is, I don't think this is I think it's a matter of just making sure that we're saying the same thing.
Right.
That's-
Yeah, and I think the hospitals, we have to be very clear as RSS training the
Yeah.
hospitals and what they have to do to meet
Right.
their deliverable and what else the tool is recommended for beyond that, certainly, but what the minimum is to meet their deliverable.
All right.
And so we'll get back to you on that.
And I would just make the comment, I think I'd rather see the number be smaller and the requirement to think it through and discuss it be larger. So, you know, if you have 5 things they have to do, but you really want them to think through the mitigation and all that, I think there's more value in that. 'Cause
Well, that's what I was talking about with
Yeah.
respect to choosing the HVA
Okay.
items, although I appreciate Gary's comment about that.
More
Some
is-
of these elements
less is
they're
more.
stable, they're there all the time, so
Mhm.
it doesn't matter. But we have to be careful that we're not trying to go back and rewrite the element completion, because that's a whole nother, that's not a place you wanna go.
I mean, the element of completion is simply the completed
Yeah,
spreadsheet.
yeah.
That's why I said, you know,
Yeah, I think-
What is,
you know, emphasizing for value.
What do you mean by complete?
You could do both.
Exactly.
You could submit, I mean, it might be simple as to simply have them both submitted. Because this is all product, it comes as one anyway. So submit the whole thing that you did. But my concern is that we'll, I mean, I'll just have to speak it, that I think most folks will probably overdo it and think that they've gotta populate every single thing in every category. But there's always gonna be somebody who's gonna come up with something that's gonna be the opposite of the curve.
Well, that's why it's
And
really,
that's unfortunately
yeah.
a matter we have.
And that's why it's really important for us,
We
as
have
the
to
RSC is offering the training,
Exactly.
to know what the minimum requirement is, so that's how we can educate folks in the training.
Exactly. I think there are 2 concepts here to take into consideration. One is to be compliant with the contract. And the deliverable, the element of completion is pretty clear. We didn't want to get into the details because we wanted to, you know, wait for this presentation, see, you know, how far we can go in terms of, granularity of the information which will be provided in the chart. That's one thing. A different thing is to create value for the hospital. So I think that, as Shannon said, besides the element of completion, then Mike can, work always in adherence with you all regarding that. But, if there is some sort of common ground for the RRC, RTC, in order to provide that piece of information to get value, to offer value to the hospitals, we accomplish both things.
Before I start losing people.
I just want to add one thing, when you talk about like the value to the hospitals, but I think one thing when we look at these types of tools and any type of data that we end up submitting up to the state, and this has been expressed in my region tremendously, they send information up to the state, and never see anything on the backside to close the loop. Now, you're gonna have these charts from all the different hospitals, and what's gonna be done at the state? If you take this information and, you know, we talked about yesterday doing kind of regional HVAs and populating these charts based on the region and saying, you know what? All of these hospitals have identified, you know, fuel oil at the 20-hour mark are all gonna have to evacuate. But we're not gonna be able to really facilitate a region-wide evacuation if all the hospitals have to pull the trigger at 20 hours. So is there a way on the backside to look at it from the state and pre-populating asset request forms, looking at adjusting the MERC based upon the results that we're seeing here?
That was discussed
Yeah,
early
that was-
in this project,
It was.
actually.
That was kind of a central discussion early on, was doing a gap analysis.
To answer your question, to do that, we would have to collect the Excel tables and actually evaluate the data in the tables. So you'd have, if 145 hospitals were doing it, you'd have to actually take the data in the tables and evaluate it in some way, shape, or form. To say, ooh, there's an issue with fuel oil, as a for instance, and funnel that back out into the field to the coalitions and down the line, so to speak, into the field to actually address those items. We can do that, I guess, I mean, because I know this was discussed early on
Yeah,
as
and
part of
at
the
this
process.
point, you know,
but
we've
that's
got the
been-
regional office people here, so, you know, if there's, in terms of the coalition work and regional planning, if there's some value to collecting these, and we talked about, you know, how would we do a gap analysis using these charts, and, you know, what are the limitations and the difficulties, but if there's value to bringing these together for regional planning,
Well, I'd be
we
sure.
could do it.
I mean, I would think that someone would wanna know that information, because you're gonna start filtering requests on that.
The-
Well, these
the
are due in
difficulty,
June,
though-
right?
Yeah,
So we wouldn't really be able to do anything with them until next year, correct?
probably not.
Yeah, I'm just saying from phase two, I mean, you know, again, in my region, you know, you have all these requests for data, and then they just kind of fall into this black hole, and then there's no follow-up or no
Well,
phase two.
there are
or-
two things here to take into consideration. One is the facility level. They have a tool for their own facility, which would be, in my opinion, enough to justify the whole time and effort they put into this tool. And another thing, at a, you know, overarching perspective, at the regional level and the statewide level, yeah, I agree with you. We can collect this information and we can come up with, you know, something else to follow up with the needs of the region. But, you know, from a facility perspective, they get something valuable immediately back. They apply this, they know better about how to sustain themselves for the 96-hour just following a disaster like that. So I guess that is already valuable. On top of that, I agree with you, we can do something more.
It would be
If we-
interesting to keep this stuff in mind as we move into future grant years in terms of deliverables, because I think some of the information that hospitals might share as members of the coalition could result in other mutual aid agreements about certain
Sure,
resources
sure,
we can share in our
absolutely.
regional
Yeah.
stockpiles that
State
we might
cash,
have, and how we'd be able to access those, so just to
But I
keep
think
it in
that
mind
needs to
for
be
part two.
expressed during the training, as
Yeah.
this is not just a one-time activity to meet your deliverable objective and collect your $5,000. This is the long-term idea of a long-term project that we're working on, and this is just one component of it.
For the resources, I mean, the only formula that I saw, is it's very helpful to have program calculations, but it's a basic, how much you got divided by the time. But I don't see how you do that for an elevator or some air handling equipment, electric now.
Correct. That's,
So why do we even have them in the tool? Yes,
We talked about reasonable assumptions, the discussions, things that can't be quantified have to be discussed.
we list any of those things that we think may be generally applicable to a hospital, generally important to their emergency operations in the chart. In the tool are only the things that you can calculate.
Oh, okay, so these things are not in the tool?
Right, so, you know, your power's either on or it's off.
Okay.
And you can decide at hour zero, without that, can you continue under normal operations? Or do you have to immediately go into mitigation? Or do you immediately go to red?
No, I mistakenly assumed that everything listed here is in the tool.
JT, I think that's an important point for us to carry forward, though, and it was, you know, as we progressed the last few months, we really haven't focused on that, but early on, that was central to the discussion about how to use this for regional planning and gap analysis. But before I lose people, is there information that you need, is there something you need to go train the hospitals that we have not given you here today?
Just maybe some feedback on the number of hours you think it's gonna take with actual hospitals, like to fit it into a meeting agenda. Should they come with some data, would that be helpful? And, what kind of staff would we suggest that they bring?
I think those are good questions.
Okay, let me take those one at a time. What kind of staff should they bring to the training?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the emergency manager. Is there some other category? of staff?
Materials management.
Yeah, materials management, logistics person who was ever targeted for that in their, in her chart, in
And
her HCC chart.
engineering, and operations, whatever.
Maybe your senior buyers.
In terms of how many hour agenda for emergency management committee, planning hours, how long is this gonna take? I think to a large extent, that's going to depend on how the facilities emergency management committee works and how difficult it is to get those people together. And, you know, one hospital described to me the great difficulties having with the pharmacy because they got dinged on this in their last survey last year, called me up, he says, hey, can you show me how to use this so I can get it in place and do it for this year's survey? And which they used very successfully in September. But he was describing to me the great difficulties having with his pharmacist. You know, the pharmacist is just, so, well, what do you mean? And, well, what medications? And, well, you know, I don't know. This could be a smooth process for an emergency preparedness coordinator, or depending on their, where they are in the hierarchy and the pecking order and how people respond to them, and how difficult the personalities are, it could be very stressful.
Apropos the question of collecting data on this, a process that we've been involved with out of the central office has been working primarily in New York City with all of the healthcare facilities in New York City for the purpose of planning, evacuation, and shelter in place. We fielded 3 different surveys for each of the 3 domains, so we have 9 different collection tools. Something that we put into that is not clear here, and I'm not sure it absolutely needs to be, is a whole list of planning assumptions so that we hoped to guide the types of information we're receiving back. So if you give us a number or you said yes to a particular question, we gave you a list of planning assumptions to consider before you responded. If we want to collect this kind of information, which we clearly can collect, but it doesn't have those kinds of, some kind of assumptions first, then questions like, well, what kind of medication are you talking about? Or other kinds of planning assumptions that might apply to a particular incident, or the thought process of completing some of this might give us data that's really all across the board. We can certainly collect it, but I think that I'm almost wondering whether collecting it after it's been out a while in the second year, if you will, revised or revisited and recalculated with some planning assumptions might be something to consider. It's just a thought based on other experiences.
With that being said, is there a evaluation tool for the training program after we deliver it to the group to solicit some feedback? And maybe it's not immediately after, maybe it's, a week after, and saying, hey, look, you've ran the program, what suggestions might you have to altering the tool and come up with a version 2, or version 3, whatever?
We not thought about that. That's a great idea.
Maybe we can incorporate that into the learning management system. If they sign up for it and they take the course, send it out a week later to do kind of a course review. What changes could you make, or would you recommend making, and go from there?
That could be very helpful, for those who provide the training subsequently. Somebody does it 2 months after you, they get quite a bit out of that evaluation in terms of how they interact. Just to finish on Diane's point on an agenda, I think that an agenda for the Emergency Management Committee could look kind of like this. Here's the information that we need. And at the end of it, after we've made the calculations and carried those quantifiable calculations from the tool to the chart, the next thing on the future agenda for the Emergency Management Committee would be to talk through, what are you coding yellow? And, where don't we have yellow, we go straight to red, and we need to look at that. So,
I think we're getting pretty complicated. I think the basic premise here is to get this tool out, get hospitals familiar with it, using it, and so that they understand the value of it, because I think the value's there, and they will use that, and also, the success that hospitals have had with the Joint Commission in terms of, using it for that as well. So.
Oh, please go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry, like our planning strategy right now is to roll it out in our sub-regional meetings, so that's like groups of maybe 4 to 10 hospitals at a time, or less potentially. And then, what kind of staff should be coming to those meetings, what should our focus be? They're in November, so we really need to have some idea of the elements of completion, sort of, because that'll be something key that they'll wanna know. And then they would go back and, train and utilize it within the facility, so November will come quickly, that would be our time frame.
This is a whole workbook, right? What the facilities are gonna receive and the RCs as you work through the instructions, the whole workbook,
Yeah.
not separate
Yeah,
tabs.
No, it's a workbook.
The whole book.
yeah, there's 2
Yeah,
workbooks here. I suppose we could combine them, but,
So the-
there's 2 documents.
You were referring to it as the calculator. We call that the tool.
But that's not in this workbook.
Correct.
The chart, this is one
Chart
workbook,
files.
and then that calculator tool is a second workbook.
Okay.
And those are gonna be sent out.
Yeah, we'll make a few clarifications in here, and
The ASHI article that we have, which we're gonna send to you as well, if you send that in advance, which we intended to do but never did, but if you send that in advance, ask them to read that, they'll have a really good sense of the process, and they'll be a little bit more prepared once they come into the training.
and that really covers, probably about the first half of the presentation of, going through average daily census and inventory and all of that that we covered. Well, please call us with any questions or concerns. Any other,
In terms of follow-up, I think we'll have to work with Mike
Yeah,
to send
I will-
something out, we'll define the elements of completion.
Yep.
And then in terms of, JT's concerns, some sort of just statement about, where this might all go and what we're gonna be using this for, right? I mean, is that,
Yeah, I have my first trainings actually November 14th and November 16th. I have these already scheduled.
so we'll get on it.
Yeah, I think getting back to what Mike said before, talking about his engagement with New York City, about a coastal storm planning, ESFH-centric focused effort. You know, they come up, for example, with a checklist for the shelter-in-place project and a variety of other tools that they're using down there. And there is value for the facility because going through the checklist, they know better about their own structure. And there is a value for us because we are collecting that information for planning purposes. So I believe one day we will return back to the facilities when we digest and elaborate all this mass of, you know, information that we are collecting, just to inform them about how this planning will affect them down the road. So they have, and I agree with you, they have this idea, we should put them some sort of general statement. But when they will get it, how they will get it, remain to be seen. We have to see the results of the training first, get to the end of a grant here, and then we can get back to them and see eventually if we can come up with a dedicated follow-up deliverables for them as well.
Gene, tying into that and JP's comments about the regional planning, last year, Chris and I, we did a data sharing survey facilities, and you know, we went through and asked hospitals what all the survey questions that asset survey questions that hospitals get asked. You know, that data flows to the department, they don't get it back. So we asked hospitals, in essence, what data would be important to you under what scenarios? And, you know, I forget, we had I thought, a very good participation rate. I think, you know, yeah.
And what data would they be willing to share?
Yeah, and then it asked what data would they be willing to share. And so we have an analysis of what information would hospitals like and what would they share. And a lot of that relates, you know, specifically to this stuff. So we could probably look at the results of all of the facilities here. You know, what are they running out of quickest, and how does that relate to the information that's being collected by the state that might be helpful back to them, mutual aid agreements.
Sure.
So there might be a lot we could do.
I think the next thing we should do is wrap it up.
Is it George you're on?
He's right there.